At 12:15 in the morning, a siren tore through the silence of a Soviet bunker south of Moscow. A screen lit up. One word, then a number, then a word that no one in that room ever wanted to see. Launch. 1 year Continental ballistic missile inbound from the United States. The system was certain. The duty officer had minutes to decide whether the Soviet Union was under attack and whether to say so. His name was Stanislav Petrov, and on the night of 26 September 1983, he held the end of the world in his hands. To understand what Petrov faced that night, you have to understand what the world had become in the autumn of 1983. Not the Cold War of history textbooks, a phrase that suggests something distant and managed. The Cold War of that particular autumn felt like a rope pulled taut between two people who had both forgotten how to let go. Ronald Reagan had taken office 2 years earlier with a vocabulary that unsettled even some of his own allies. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He spoke openly of prevailing in a nuclear conflict. His administration was deploying new cruise missiles in Western Europe. The Pershing II ballistic missile, capable of reaching Soviet territory in as little as 6 minutes from launch, was scheduled to arrive in West Germany before the end of the year. In Moscow, the men who ran the Soviet Union were old and afraid. They had survived the Great Patriotic War, which had killed 27 million of their countrymen. They had built their worldview around the memory of that catastrophe, and now, in their age and exhaustion, they had reasoned themselves into a belief that the Americans might be planning to strike first. This was not ordinary paranoia. It was a conviction they had reinforced through years of intelligence assessments and ideological framework. They had launched a classified operation called RWN, an acronym from the Russian words for nuclear missile attack, tasked with watching for early signs of American preparations for a preemptive strike. KGB and GRU agents were instructed to monitor American military movements, political rhetoric, hospital blood plasma purchases, the number of lights burning overnight in government buildings. Every data point of the vats of this, that another warrior of how. Then came 1 September 1983. The Soviet Su-15 interceptor shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007. The Boeing 747 had strayed into Soviet airspace on its way from Anchorage to Seoul. The Air Defense Command, reading the blip as a reconnaissance aircraft, scrambled the interceptor and fired. 269 people died. The international reaction was fury. Inside the Soviet leadership, the reaction was defensive defiance. But beneath the public posture, the incident had demonstrated with terrible clarity how quickly a misread situation could turn catastrophic. And it had hardened, in the minds of the Soviet High Command, the conviction that American hostility was not rhetorical. It was operational. 6 weeks later, NATO would launch Able Archer 83, a command-and-control exercise simulating the management of nuclear forces in an escalating war. It was more realistic than any previous simulation. New communication procedures, senior political figures involved, realistic timelines. Some Soviet intelligence officers, already primed by Ryan to look for signs of preparation, would briefly believe during that exercise that the simulation was cover for an actual attack. Able Archer was still weeks away on the night of 26 September, but the atmosphere it would crystallize was already present, already pressing down on every military installation, every duty officer sitting in the dark in front of a console, waiting for nothing. Fear had become the background radiation of the age. The bunker was called Serpukhov 15. It sat in a pine forest south of Moscow, receiving data from the Oko satellite constellation. Oko meant eye. The satellites orbited in high elliptical paths, watching the American missile fields in the Great Plains, the Minuteman silos buried in hardened concrete across Montana and Wyoming and North Dakota, maintained on constant alert, capable of reaching Soviet territory in approximately 30 minutes. The job of Oko was to detect the infrared signature of a rocket plume the moment a missile left its silo, buying the Soviet military the earliest possible warning. The system was relatively new. It had been fully operational for only a few years. Engineers within the program understood it was not without flaws. distinguishing the infrared signature of rocket exhaust from other intense heat sources, sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, thermal anomalies in the upper atmosphere, unusual geometries produced by the satellite's own orbital path, was technically demanding. The onboard computers processed these signals automatically, applying algorithms designed to filter out false readings. The algorithms were good. They were not perfect. Stanislav Petrov was a lieutenant colonel, 44 years old. He was an engineer by training who had helped design parts of the OCO system and understood its architecture the way only someone who has built something truly understands it, not just its capabilities, but its failure modes, its edge cases, the places where the system's confidence exceeded its actual reliability. He was not supposed to be on duty that night, having taken the shift of a colleague. By his own later accounts, there was nothing in the air of the bunker when the evening began to suggest it would be anything but routine. The consoles hummed. Officers logged their readings. The machinery of nuclear-age routine pressed down on everything. Imagine the room. Rows of screens bathed in cold instrument light. Dozens of people trained to specific functions within specific protocols, each knowing exactly what their role was if the sirens ever sounded. The entire architecture of the place, its personnel, its technology, its procedures, had been built around one assumption. The duty officer's job, in the event of a confirmed launch alert, was not to reason. It was to report. At 12:15 a.m., the siren sounded. Petrov looked at his screens. One missile. Inbound from the continental United States. The confidence indicator, the system's own measure of how certain it was at the highest possible level. Not a tentative reading. A declaration. The room reacted. Staff moved to their stations. Officers turned toward Petrov, waiting for his call. He had minutes. Perhaps 4. Perhaps fewer. He sat with the alarm screaming around him and made himself think. One missile. He turned the number over the way an engineer turns over a problem, procedurally looking for the logic. The Americans had thousands of warheads. Their strategic doctrine was built around a disarming first strike, a coordinated, overwhelming attack on Soviet retaliatory capability, timed to destroy enough of the Soviet arsenal before it could be launched that a response would be impossible. A disarming first strike would not look like this. It would not be one missile. It would be hundreds, launched in carefully coordinated waves, arriving simultaneously, designed to leave nothing standing to strike back. Who launches one missile at a nuclear superpower? Petrov also knew the system. The OCO constellation had limitations. Sunlight hitting high-altitude clouds at certain angles could produce infrared signatures that onboard sensors might misclassify as rocket exhaust, and the satellite's orbital geometry occasionally created anomalous readings. He had not read these things in a manual. He had helped engineer the system. The knowledge was in his hands. These thoughts moved through him in seconds. Then the screen updated. A second missile. A third. Fourth. Fifth. 5 inbound ICBMs. Highest confidence. Highest alert. 5 was harder to dismiss than 1. 5 carried a different weight. Around him, the room was in controlled agitation, people doing exactly what they had been trained to do, which meant looking at Petrov because Petrov had the phone. He later said, in careful, reluctant interviews given years after the declassification, that he was not certain. He was never certain. What he felt, he said, was that the probability of a false alarm was greater than the probability of this being real. It was not a feeling. It was a judgment. The judgment rested on 2 things: the illogic of launching only 5 missiles in a genuine first strike, and his engineering knowledge of where the system could fail. He picked up the phone. He reported a malfunction. His voice stayed steady. He stayed on the line, and he waited. Ha ha! He was right. The investigation that followed, conducted over weeks and months, according to accounts that emerged gradually over subsequent years, determined that the OCO system had been deceived by a rare atmospheric alignment. Sunlight striking high-altitude clouds at a particular angle, combined with a specific geometry of the satellite's orbital path as it passed over the American Midwest, had produced an infrared signature the onboard computers classified as the exhaust plume of a launched ICBM. The error was not random noise, it was a systematized, 5 missiles that never left their silos. A first strike that never happened. A war that was not begun. What would have followed if Petrov had followed protocol, if he had picked up that phone and reported an inbound attack rather than a malfunction, cannot be known with certainty. The Soviet command system had human checks. His report would have traveled up a chain of authority, and at each level someone would have been asking the same questions. It is possible that cooler heads might still have found reason to hesitate. Or perhaps not, in the grip of fear, in a political atmosphere already strained by Flight 007, already shadowed by the coming of Able Archer, with the conviction of American hostility entrenched in the leadership's worldview, the pressure to act before inbound warheads arrived might have been decisive. The Soviet doctrine of the time required that retaliation be credible, and credibility required that the arsenal not be caught on the ground. Every protocol, every career incentive, every trained reflex in that system pointed towards Spies. One man's decision removed the question entirely. The phone call that might have set the sequence in motion was never made. No alert reached the generals, and the political leadership was never asked to consider launching. A single refusal, a judgment made by one lieutenant colonel in a pine forest south of Moscow, created a gap in the escalation chain. And the chain held. What happened to Stanislav Petrov afterward is its own kind of story, a quieter one, and in some ways a sadder one. He was not rewarded. There was no ceremony, no medal, no official acknowledgement that what he had done mattered. His superiors, by his account, were not ungrateful. They were uncomfortable. To formally recognize him would have required acknowledging that the Oko system had generated a catastrophically false alert, that the Soviet Union's premier nuclear early warning satellite had nearly triggered a war. In an institution built on the presumption of technical infallibility, that kind of acknowledgement was not possible. He was reportedly reprimanded for filling out his duty log in pencil rather than ink. In the chaos of those minutes, he had grabbed the nearest writing instrument. The regulation required ink. The regulation was enforced. This is what bureaucracies do with events they cannot absorb. He retired from the military not long afterward. By his own accounts, he struggled in the years that followed, dealing with periods of depression, with a sense of displacement that perhaps only a man who has held the world in his hands and then returned to ordinary life could fully understand. His wife Raisa died of cancer. He lived alone in a small apartment in Fryazevo outside Moscow. He did not speak publicly about what had happened. The world outside did not know his name. The incident remained classified for years. It began to surface in the mid-1990s through accounts by former Soviet officers. Petrov gave his first public interviews in the years that followed, careful, precise, sometimes visibly reluctant. He insisted, with what observers described as genuine sincerity, that he had not been a hero, that any reasonable person in his position would have made the same judgment, that the system had failed and he had simply noticed. He was recognized more warmly outside Russia than within it. A German foundation gave him an award. He visited the United Nations, where officials who had spent careers thinking about nuclear risk sat across from him and struggled to find words adequate to the occasion. In 2013, he received the Dresden Prize, a German award honoring extraordinary contributions to peace. A documentary film made him its subject, bringing his story to an audience that, for the most part, had no idea it had happened. He died on 19 May 2017 in his apartment in Fryazevo, at the age of 77. For several months, no public announcement was made. His death emerged from silence in September of that year, when a German activist tried to reach him to pass along congratulations on an award and learned after some difficulty that Petrov was gone. The activist announced it publicly. The world learned, belatedly, that the man who had declined to end it was no longer in it. There is a particular kind of courage that gets no parade. Not the courage of charging forward under fire, which is immediate and witnessed and folded into the language of valor, nor the courage of public dissent, which at least leaves a record. Not even the courage of the long private resistance that history sometimes eventually uncovers. The courage Petrov exercised that night was narrower and stranger. It was the courage of a man who looked at a screaming machine and said, "I don't think so." He could have been wrong. If the missiles had been real and he had reported a malfunction, he would have handed the Soviet military a catastrophic intelligence failure. The warheads would have arrived and found no response prepared. His name, in that version of events, would be remembered very differently, if anyone was left to remember it. But he trusted himself over the system. He trusted the logic of what he knew about deterrence, about the mathematics of a genuine first strike, about the gap between how a rational adversary actually behaves and what 5 blips on a screen were suggesting. In the 4 or 5 minutes before the crisis became something else, he applied engineering knowledge to a military emergency. He held the line at the place where no one else was watching. That tension, between the machine and the human, between the protocol and the judgment, between the instruction and the pause before you follow it, has not gone away. The systems have grown more complex in the decades since, the decision cycles shorter, the automation deeper. The question of who is in the loop and how much authority rests with a human being capable of the kind of reasoning Petrov applied in those minutes is not a historical question. It is a present one. One man, alone at a console in the dark. He chose not to end the world. Then he went home. He wrote his report in pencil and told almost no one what he had done. Andy lived a quiet life in a small apartment, while the world that did not know his name continued on. This was Triechos. Some hands hold everything and open quietly without a sound. Some rooms contain the whole of history. No one marked. A 9-year-old boy stood before an altar, placed his hand on the sacrificed animal, and swore an oath that would shake the most powerful city on earth. He promised that as long as he lived, he would be the enemy of Rome. Most childhood vows are forgotten by morning. This one was not. The boy grew into the most dangerous man the Roman Republic would ever face. A general so feared that mothers in Rome would quiet their children with his name. He led an army across the sea, over mountains thought impossible to cross, with war elephants at his side. He marched into the heart of Italy, and there he destroyed Roman army after Roman army, until on a single afternoon he killed more Romans than had ever died in one day before or since. For 15 years he roamed their homeland, and Rome could not stop him. His name was Hannibal Barca, and this is the story of how one man came closer than anyone in history to ending Rome. To understand Hannibal, you have to understand the hatred he was born into. In the 3rd century before Christ, 2 cities stood above all others in the Western world. One was Rome, a rising republic in Italy, hungry, disciplined, and growing. The other was Carthage, a magnificent trading empire on the coast of North Africa, rich beyond imagination, its ships ruling the Mediterranean. 2 powers that large could not share the same sea forever. They collided in the long and brutal struggle, remembered as the First Punic War. For more than 20 years, Rome and Carthage tore at each other across Sicily and the waves. In the end, Carthage lost. It was forced to surrender, to pay a crushing fine, and to give up the island it had fought so hard to hold. For Rome, it was a triumph. For Carthage, it was a humiliation that burned. One Carthaginian general felt that humiliation more deeply than anyone. His name was Hamilcar Barca, and he was Hannibal's father. He had never been beaten in open battle in Sicily, yet he had been forced to lay down his arms because his city had lost the war at sea. To a proud commander, surrendering ground he had personally defended was a wound that never healed. So Hamilcar turned his eyes west, to Spain. The Iberian Peninsula was wild, wealthy, and largely beyond Rome's reach. Its mines held silver. Its tribes could be turned into soldiers. Hamilcar set out to build a new Carthaginian empire there, one strong enough to one day challenge Rome again. And he took his young sons with him. It was here, before sailing to Spain, that the boy Hannibal is said to have sworn his famous oath. According to the story, he begged to come along, and his father agreed on one condition. He led the boy to an altar and made him swear eternal hostility to Rome. Hannibal grew up in a war camp. While Roman boys his age studied in safety, he learned to ride, to fight, and to command among hardened soldiers. The army was his school, and his father's grudge against Rome was his first lesson. Hamilcar died while Hannibal was still young, drowned during a campaign in Spain. Leadership passed first to Hannibal's brother-in-law, and then, when he too was killed, The army turned to Hannibal himself. He was only in his mid-20s, and already he commanded the Carthaginian forces in Spain. The soldiers loved him, and the reason is easy to understand. He ate what they ate and slept on the bare ground wrapped in a common soldier's cloak. In battle he was first into the fight and last to leave it, and on the march he could outthink rival commanders while outlasting his own men in sheer endurance. To the army, he was not a distant aristocrat. He was one of them, only better at everything. Hannibal did not wait long to provoke the giant. In Spain stood a city called Saguntum, an ally of Rome. Hannibal besieged it, took it, and in doing so threw down a challenge no one in Rome could ignore. Messengers raced to Carthage demanding that Hannibal be handed over. Carthage refused. And so, in 218 BC, the Second Punic War began. The Romans expected a familiar kind of war. They would raise their legions, sail to Spain and Africa, and crush Carthage at the edges of its power. What they did not expect, what no one expected, was that the war would come to them. Hannibal had a plan so daring it bordered on madness. He would not wait for Rome to invade. He would invade Rome. Not by sea, where Roman fleets were strong, but by land, marching an entire army out of Spain through southern Gaul and over the Alps into Italy itself. No one believed it could be done. The mountains were a wall of stone and ice, guarded by fierce tribes, swept by avalanches and storms. To bring tens of thousands of men, horses, and war elephants across them seemed impossible. That impossibility was exactly why Hannibal chose it. He set out with a great army, but the journey devoured it. Crossing the broad rivers of Gaul cost him men and animals. Hostile tribes shadowed his march and struck at his column, and then came the mountains. The crossing of the Alps became one of the most famous feats in military history. Imagine it. A column of soldiers from the warm Mediterranean climbing into a world of snow and thin air. Paths narrowed to ledges above terrible drops. Rock slides buried men where they stood. Local warriors rolled boulders down from the heights and ambushed the rear of the column. At night, the cold killed those the cliffs had spared. The elephants struggled upward through the snow, strange gray giants in a frozen land, terrifying to the tribes who had never seen such beasts. At one point, the path was blocked by a landslide, and the army had to carve a new road out of the rock before they could go on. When Hannibal finally descended into Italy, his army was a shadow of what it had been. He had lost nearly half his men to the mountains and the march. Cold, hungry, and exhausted, his soldiers stumbled down onto the northern plains. By every reasonable measure, he should have been finished before the war had even truly begun. But Hannibal was just getting started. The tribes of northern Italy had no love for Rome, and many flocked to join him, swelling his ranks. He rested his men, gathered strength, and prepared to do what he had come to do. The Romans, stunned that the war had arrived on their doorstep, marched out to crush this audacious invader. They were confident, fighting on home ground with the greatest military machine in the world at their backs. What they had never faced was a mind like Hannibal's. At a river called the Trebia, in the cold of winter, he lured an overeager Roman army across the freezing water. Exhausted and unfed, then sprang a trap with troops he had hidden in waiting. The Roman force was shattered. The following year, he did something even bolder. Marching through difficult country, he set an ambush beside the misty shore of Lake Trasimene. As an entire Roman army advanced along the road in morning fog, Hannibal's men fell on them from the high ground. Trapped between the hills and the water, thousands of Romans were cut down or drowned. A Roman consul died on the field. Two great armies destroyed in 2 years. Rome was shaken to its core. In their fear, the Romans appointed a dictator named Fabius, a cautious man with a radical idea. He refused to give Hannibal the open battle he wanted. Instead, he shadowed the Carthaginians, harassed them, cut off their supplies, and never let himself be drawn into a fight he might lose. It was wise, and it was deeply unpopular. Romans were proud. They wanted a hero who would smash the invader, not a general who seemed to run away. They mocked Fabius and called him the delayer. So Rome changed its approach. It raised the largest army it had ever assembled, tens of thousands of men, and sent them to end Hannibal once and for all. The two sides met in the summer of 216 BC, near a town in southern Italy called Canna. What happened there is still studied in military academies today. Hannibal was heavily outnumbered. By any normal logic, a smaller army caught in the open by a much larger one should be destroyed. Hannibal turned that logic into a weapon. He arranged his line in a gentle curve, bulging out toward the Romans, with his weaker troops in the center and his hardened veterans on the wings. The huge Roman army drove straight at the center, pushing it back. To the Romans, it looked like victory. They surged forward into the bending line, certain they were breaking through. They were walking into a trap. As the Carthaginian center gave ground, it did not break. It bent backward, drawing the Romans deeper, until the curve reversed and the Romans found themselves pressing into a pocket. Then Hannibal's powerful wings swung inward, and his cavalry, having scattered the Roman horsemen, came crashing in from behind. In a few hours, the largest army Rome had ever fielded was surrounded on every side. Packed so tightly they could barely raise their weapons, the Romans were slaughtered where they stood. Tens of thousands died in a single afternoon, among them consuls, former consuls, and a great part of Rome's leadership. Cannae was not just a victory. It was annihilation. It remains one of the most perfect battles ever fought, the dream every general since has tried to repeat. After Cannae, it seemed the unthinkable might happen. Rome's allies began to waver. Cities defected. The road to Rome itself lay open, and one of Hannibal's officers urged him to march on the city at once. There is a famous line that the officer told him he knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one. For whatever reason, Hannibal did not march on Rome. Historians still argue about why. Perhaps he lacked the siege equipment to storm such a vast walled city. Maybe he believed Rome would be forced to the table, or simply could not afford the losses a direct assault would cost. He expected the Romans, beaten so badly, to come to terms, as any sensible power would. But Rome was not any power. This is the heart of the story. Hannibal had done everything right. He had won battle after battle, destroyed army after army, and stood as the greatest general of his age. And still, Rome would not surrender. The Romans made a decision that defined them. They simply refused to lose. New legions were raised from boys and old men. Slaves were armed and pressed into the ranks, and after a single day of public mourning, the city turned back to war. Quietly, Rome returned to the hated strategy of Fabius, refusing open battle and wearing Hannibal down year after year. Hannibal was a lion loose in Italy, but he was alone. He was far from home, his reinforcements blocked, his brother defeated and killed trying to reach him. He could win battles forever, but he could not be everywhere, and he could not replace his veterans the way Rome replaced its dead. Slowly, the war turned. A new Roman general rose, a brilliant young commander named Scipio. Rather than face Hannibal directly in Italy, Scipio struck at the source. He drove the Carthaginians out of Spain, and then he did to Carthage what Hannibal had done to Rome. He carried the war to Africa, straight toward Carthage itself. Now it was Carthage that was afraid. In desperation, the city recalled Hannibal home. After 15 years on Italian soil, undefeated in the field, he was forced to abandon his great campaign to save his homeland. In 202 BC, near a place called Zama, the two greatest commanders of the age finally faced each other. Scipio had studied Hannibal for years and had learned his lessons well. This time, Hannibal's cavalry was outmatched, his veteran corps worn thin, his elephants turned aside. At Zama, Hannibal lost. Carthage surrendered. The terms were merciless. It gave up its navy, its empire, and its freedom to wage war. The city that had once ruled the sea was reduced to a shadow living under Rome's shadow. Yet Hannibal's story was not finished. For a time he tried to rebuild Carthage from within, reforming its government and finances with the same brilliance he had shown in war. But Rome never forgot him, and never stopped fearing him. Under pressure, he was forced to flee his own city. He spent his final years in exile, a wandering legend offering his genius to Rome's enemies in the East, always hunted, always watched. In the end, the Romans cornered him. Rather than be captured and dragged through their streets, Hannibal took poison he is said to have carried in a ring. His reported last words were bitter and proud, that he would now relieve Rome of the long anxiety it had felt, since it seemed too much for the Romans to wait for the death of a hated old man. So what was Hannibal, in the end? He was the general who beat Rome again and again, and still lost the war. He won nearly every battle and lost the only thing that mattered. His tactics were so flawless that for 2,000 years, soldiers have studied Cannae and dreamed of repeating it. Yet brilliance on the battlefield was not enough against a city that refused absolutely to accept defeat. In a strange way, Hannibal made Rome what it became. He pushed it to the edge of destruction, and in surviving him, Rome learned how to endure anything. The empire that would one day rule the known world was forged in the terror of those years when a Carthaginian and his elephants walked through Italy and could not be stopped. The boy had kept his oath. For his entire life he had been the enemy of Rome. He marched across mountains the world called impassable. He shattered the greatest armies of his age. He held a hostile homeland in fear for 15 years, and he died still refusing to bow. And yet he did not destroy Rome. In the end, no single man could. But more than 2,000 years later, we still speak his name with something close to awe, because for one long, astonishing moment, the fate of the entire ancient world rested on the will of a man who had sworn, as a child, that he would never stop fighting. On the 26th of December, 1900, a lighthouse keeper named Joseph Moore stepped ashore on a small island in the Atlantic and called out for his colleagues. No one answered. He called again. The lighthouse stood intact. The lamp had been cleaned, trimmed, and refilled, ready to burn. The gate to the compound was shut. The main door was shut. But the 3 men who lived there were gone. They were never found. What happened on Isle en Meath that December, and why no one has ever been able to say for certain, is a story that has haunted Scotland for over 120 years. It is a story about the sea, about isolation, and about the terrifying speed with which the ocean can erase a human being without leaving a single trace. The Flannan Isles are a group of small, uninhabited islands in the Outer Hebrides, roughly 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in northwest Scotland. Sailors called them the Seven Hunters. They rise sharply from the Atlantic, raw windswept platforms of gneiss and grass, pounded by some of the most violent weather in the British Isles. They are beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are indifferent to you. In the 1890s, the Northern Lighthouse Board built a lighthouse on the largest of the islands, Isle en Meath, to guide ships through the treacherous passage between the Outer Hebrides and the open ocean. It was completed in 1899. The tower stood 20 meters tall, the light visible for 24 miles. Just getting equipment ashore required cranes and ropes and ladders bolted into the cliff face, because there was no beach, no harbor. Only 2 concrete landing stages cut into the rock, one on the east side, one on the side. To keep a lighthouse burning required men who were willing to live with almost nothing. A small stone building on a remote rock, weeks without contact with shore, and the constant hammering wind. The Northern Lighthouse Board assigned 3 keepers to Isle en Meath at any time, rotating a 4th man on and off to allow shore leave. The rotation vessel was the lighthouse tender Hesperus, out of the port of Briascleet on Lewis. In December 1900, the 3 men on the island were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. James Ducat was the principal keeper, the senior man. He was 43 years old, had been in lighthouse service since 1878, and had been promoted to principal just 4 years earlier. He was married, with 4 children. His eldest daughter was 16. His youngest son was 6. Colleagues described him as experienced, steady, a man who knew what he was doing. Thomas Marshall was the second assistant. He was 28 years old. He had started as a seaman, worked briefly on Ailsa Craig, and had been with the Northern Lighthouse Board since 1896. He was unmarried. Donald MacArthur was the occasional keeper, a substitute filling in for William Ross, who was on sick leave. MacArthur left behind a wife and 2 children. He was, by several accounts, a volatile and physical man. Whether that character trait has any bearing on what happened is something we will come back to. 3 men on a rock in the Atlantic, 30 miles from the nearest town, in winter. The first sign that something had gone wrong came not from the island, but from the sea. On the 15th of December, 1900, a passing steamer, the Archtor, logged that the Flannan light was not burning. The ship's officers noted the darkness and moved on. When the Archtor reached Lee 3 days later, on the 18th, the report was relayed to the Northern Lighthouse Board. By that point, the light had been dark for at least 3 nights. The Hesperus was scheduled to make its routine relief run to the island on the 20th of December, but the weather in those days was brutal. Gales sweeping in from the northwest, and the tender could not leave port. It was delayed again and again. It was not until noon on the 26th of December, 11 days after the light went dark, that the Hesperus finally reached Ilion Moor. What greeted the crew was silence. No flag flew from the flagpole, the required signal that the keepers had seen the vessel. No one appeared at the landing stage. Captain Jim Harvey blasted the ship's whistle, fired a flare. Nothing moved on the island. There was no response of any kind. Harvey sent Joseph Moore ashore alone. Moore climbed the concrete steps cut into the cliff, walked up through the island's low grass, and reached the lighthouse. The gate was closed. The door was closed. He pushed it open and went in. The kitchen was tidy. The lamps were cleaned and prepared. The log on the slate recorded the last barometer readings at 9 in the morning of December 15th. There was no indication of what happened after that. 2 sets of oilskins, the heavy waterproof gear keepers wore when working near the landings, were missing. 1 set of oilskins remained on its hook inside the lighthouse. That detail is important. It means 2 of the men had dressed for wet, exposed conditions outside. 1 had not. 1 man had left the lighthouse without his protective gear. Moore searched the island. He found nothing. No bodies. No signs of struggle. No note. He returned to the Hesperus and reported to Harvey, who sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board. The message read, "A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island." 3 days later, on the 29th of December, the Northern Lighthouse Board Superintendent, Robert Muirhead, arrived on the island to conduct a formal investigation. Muirhead was methodical. He examined the lighthouse thoroughly, recorded everything he found, and then walked to the western landing stage. What he found there changed the nature of the inquiry. The west landing had been devastated. A storage box positioned at 33 meters, over 100 feet above sea level, had been broken open, and its contents scattered. Iron railings along the path had been bent and twisted out of shape. A section of railway track used to haul equipment up from the landing stage had been wrenched from its concrete moorings. A rock weighing more than a ton had been displaced. Turf had been ripped away from the cliff top 60 meters above the sea. This was not ordinary storm damage. This was something else. Something that came from the water with enough force to tear iron from concrete and move a 1,000-kilogram stone. Muirhead described the destruction as difficult to believe unless actually seen. He reached a conclusion. 2 of the men, most likely Ducat and Marshall, then Marshall had been fined 5 shillings earlier that year when equipment washed away in a gale. A record suggests he may have been fined 5 shillings earlier that year when equipment washed away in a gale. A record suggests he may have been especially anxious not to let it happen again. While they were at the landing, an enormous wave, what mariners sometimes call a rogue sea, an abnormal swill, said tapping against There were no bodies. There never would be. The Atlantic does not give back what it takes. Muirhead's official report recorded all 3 men as having died by probable drowning. Their deaths were entered in the death register for the district of Carloway. That is what the evidence actually shows. And it matters to say that clearly, because what most people know about the Flannan Isles Lighthouse is not the evidence. It is a poem. In 1912, 12 years after the disappearance, the English poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson published a ballad called Flannan Isle. It is a genuinely powerful piece of work, lyrical, unsettling, beautifully written, and it invented things. Gibson's poem describes the Discovery crew finding an uneaten meal laid out on the table, an overturned chair, and other details that suggested the keepers had vanished mid-moment, interrupted while going about their evening. These images, the cold supper, the knocked-over chair, lodged themselves in the public imagination and were repeated so many times in popular retellings that they came to be treated as documented fact. They are not. Joseph Moore's actual account does not describe any of this. His report noted the kitchen was tidy. There is no official record of an uneaten meal, no overturned chair. Moore described the utensils as clean, which he took to mean the men had already eaten before whatever happened. There is another fabricated element worth addressing directly. In the early 20th century, a set of dramatic logbook entries circulated widely, supposedly written by Thomas Marshall in the days before the disappearance. These entries described a terrible storm on December 12th, Ducat going very quiet, MacArthur weeping, all three men praying. A final entry allegedly read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." Subsequent investigation, most notably by researcher Mike Dash, writing for the Fortean Times, determined that these log entries are fictional. They never existed. The actual logbook records barometric readings and weather conditions in dry, professional language. And there is another problem. The weather records from that period show no unusual storms in the Flannan Isles area on December 12th, 13th, or 14th. Whatever struck the West Landing appears to have come on or around December 15th, the last day the lost. The poem is literature. The fabricated log entries are invention. What remains when you strip those away is the documented record, and it is, if anything, more disturbing for being more real. The truth as Muirhead understood it is this. 3 experienced men, in the middle of winter, went to work near a cliff edge in the North Atlantic. A wave? Possibly a single enormous wave, possibly a sequence of swells from an approaching storm, came over the landing platform without warning. They had no time to react. They went into the water. In seas that cold, in water that far from shore, with no one watching and no ship nearby, survival was essentially impossible. It is worth pausing to understand what that kind of wave actually looks like. The western landing at Ely and Mull faced directly into the Atlantic's fetch, the unbroken stretch of open ocean extending for thousands of miles. In winter, when low-pressure systems stack up off the coast, wave trains from multiple directions can constructively interfere, stacking energy into a single swell that arrives far larger than anything the weather at that moment would seem to predict. A robe sea. It can be beautiful to look at. It can also arrive in seconds, 40 feet tall, and consume everything in its path. The rock Muirhead found displaced, 1,000 kilograms, moved across the clifftop. Tells you something about the force involved. There's one detail the evidence cannot fully resolve, and it is the most quietly troubling part of the whole story. The gate to the compound was closed. The main door was closed. If 3 men left the lighthouse in a hurry, one without his oilskins, and were swept away before they could return, who closed the door? There are reasonable answers. Perhaps the gate and door were already shut when the men went out, and remained so because no one came back to open them. Perhaps the lighthouse's routine habits of securing the building were simply maintained until the moment everything went wrong. But the detail lingers. Someone shut the door, and then there was no one left to open it. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was automated in 1971. Nobody lives on Ely and Moor anymore. The island has no residents, no regular visitors, no permanent human presence beyond the light itself, which still functions, still warns ships away from the rocks, still sweeps the dark Atlantic every 15 seconds. The families of the 3 men who died there, the 4 children of James Ducat, the wife and children of Donald MacArthur, the father and siblings of Thomas Marshall, never received a body to bury. What they received was a telegram, a pension, and a piece of paper in a death register that listed the cause of death as probably drowning. Probably, that word doing a great deal of work. What is certain is that 3 men were on that island, doing their jobs, and then they were not. The lamp was clean. The lens was polished. The log was current. They had done everything right. They were ready to burn the light through another winter night on the edge of the world. They just never came back to light it. There is something that the myth-making around this story obscures. The invented suppers, the weeping keepers, the poetic overturned chair. All of that drama is layered on top of something that is already, without any embellishment, almost unbearable to contemplate. 3 men, doing a hard and isolated job, were killed by the sea on a winter afternoon. Their colleagues discovered them missing 11 days later. The investigation concluded they drowned. No one saw it happen. No one ever will. We want the overturned chair because it gives us a scene to imagine, a moment to point to. It makes the mystery feel like a puzzle, something that might yet be solved if we look at it from the right angle. But the real record does not offer that comfort. It offers something starker. The Atlantic took 3 men and gave nothing back. The lighthouse stood there, lamp clean and ready, waiting for hands that never returned. Some mysteries are not puzzles. Some are just the face of the world without its mask on. This was Triecos. Some doors stay shut. Some questions are answered only by silence and the sea. In the spring of 1925, the man walked into a Parisian hotel suite, spread official-looking documents across the table, and told 5 of the city's most successful scrap metal dealers a secret so outrageous it had to be true. The Eiffel Tower, he said quietly, was going to be torn down. The government needed absolute discretion. And the contract, the right to demolish it and sell 30,000 tons of iron, was available to one of them. He was lying about every single word. And it worked. Victor Lustig was many things. A thief, a forger, a genius of nerve, a man who once conned Al Capone and walked away richer for it. But the Eiffel Tower was the masterpiece. The con, so audacious, so perfectly calibrated to the vanity and greed and embarrassment of its victims, that he pulled it off twice. Picture Paris in the early summer of 1925. The city is glittering and broke. The Great War has left France technically victorious and economically hollowed out, and the franc is crumbling. Government budgets are stretched. And the Eiffel Tower, this iron monument that the city once despised, built as a temporary structure for the 1889 World's Fair and never quite removed, is an expensive headache. It costs money to maintain. It leaks and rusts. The newspapers grumble about it regularly. This is the detail Victor Lustig had noticed, not the tower, the complaints about the tower. He was born in 1890, according to most accounts, in Hostine, a small town in Bohemia, then part of Austria-Hungary. He was educated, multilingual, said to speak 5 languages fluently, and possessed of a quality that cannot be taught and can barely be described. Charm is too soft a word. It was a kind of total presence. When Victor Lustig gave you his attention, you felt selected, singled out, important. He had the bearing of a man who had been somewhere better than where he was and was graciously condescending to visit. He had learned that bearing on the great ocean liners. For years before Paris, Lustig made his living crossing the Atlantic, first class, always, on the ships that carried wealthy passengers between Europe and America. Those voyages were floating worlds, insulated from consequence, where strangers with money had nothing to do but gamble and talk and form quick, credulous friendships with people they would never see again. Lustig had styled himself Count. The title was invented. The impression it made was entirely real. He understood something on those ships that most people never grasp. Wealth alone does not protect you from a con. It makes you more vulnerable. A wealthy person has pride in their judgment. They believe they have seen enough of the world to read people accurately. A skilled grifter does not target that pride directly. That would trigger resistance. He flatters it. He offers the wealthy mark a scenario in which their superior judgment is proven right again. Then he walks away with their money. By the time Lustig arrived in Paris in his mid-30s, he had been running variations on this principle for over a decade. The Eiffel Tower scheme began, according to various accounts of his life, when Lustig read a newspaper article about the tower's mounting maintenance costs. He recognized what he was looking at immediately. Not a problem, an opportunity. The public grumbling was real. The financial pressures on the French government were real. All he needed to do was take those real facts and build a fictional structure around them convincing enough to stand for a week. He had official stationery forged. He invented a title for himself, Deputy Director General of the Ministère des Postes et Télégraphes. The ministry was real. The position was not. He selected 5 names, the most prominent scrap metal dealers in the Paris region, and sent each of them a letter on ministry letterhead requesting their attendance at a meeting of the highest sensitivity. Government business, not to be discussed outside these walls. The meeting place mattered. He chose the Hôtel de Crillon, one of the grandest hotels in Paris, overlooking the Place de la Concorde. The Crillon was not where fraudsters operated. It was where embassies held receptions and cabinet ministers lunched. Choosing it was itself a statement. A lie told in a grand enough room begins to feel like a fact. The dealers arrived. They walked through the lobby, the marble, the chandeliers, the practiced discretion of the staff, and found Lustig waiting in a private suite. He was impeccably dressed and unhurried, exuding the mild weariness of a man burdened by the weight of state responsibilities he had not chosen and could not share. He thanked them for their discretion, lowered his voice, and explained. The Eiffel Tower had become untenable. The maintenance costs were unsustainable. The structure needed constant upkeep, and the public funds were simply not there. A decision had been made at the highest level: demolition. But the public would object. Sentiment, tourism, the newspapers, which was precisely why the process had to be handled quietly before any announcement was made. He was authorized, he said, to receive sealed bids from interested parties. The winner would receive the demolition contract and the rights to the scrap iron. 30,000 tons of it. He was measuring them all the while. A man like Lustig does not simply pitch. He watches, catalogs, and notes which face flinches and which leans forward, who asks questions about the process, and who asks questions about the iron price per ton. He was looking for a specific combination: ambition, insecurity, and hunger to belong. And he found it before the meeting ended. His name was André Poisson. He was new money, ambitious, provincial, slightly uncertain of his place in Parisian business society. He wanted very much to matter, needing, perhaps, to prove to the older establishment dealers that he could move in circles they hadn't managed to reach. Lustig saw it with the precision of a man who has spent his life reading the room. In the days that followed, Lustig gave Poisson extra private meetings. Exclusive access, the flattering attention of a senior official who seemed to find Poisson's perspective particularly valuable. He let Poisson feel that he was being chosen, that out of 5 men, the ministry's representative had quietly decided this was the right partner. And then Lustig did something counterintuitive, something that elevates the entire scheme into a kind of dark art. He asked Poisson for a bribe. Not overtly, not crudely. He implied it, the subtle suggestion that a civil servant operating in a delicate situation had certain personal needs that a successful and sophisticated businessman would understand how to address. A gesture of good faith between men who both knew how the world really worked. It was a stroke of brilliance, and here is why. A man who pays a bribe cannot go to the police. He has just confessed to attempting to corrupt a government official. A bribe makes you complicit. The secret is no longer just the seller's, it is now the buyer's too. Lustig had not merely tricked Poisson, he had recruited him as a co-conspirator in his own deception. Poisson paid. He handed over a cash sum, the bribe, and then a much larger amount representing his sealed bid for the contract itself. The exact figures are disputed in different accounts, but the sums cited most often suggest Poisson paid the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars in total. Lustig pocketed everything and boarded the next train to Vienna. He waited, reading the French newspapers carefully, watching for any mention of fraud, any police announcement, any name. Nothing came. André Poisson was too ashamed to report it. He had been foolish enough to bribe a government official. He had believed a lie so preposterous that admitting it publicly would have destroyed him, not just financially, but socially, in front of every competitor he had been trying to impress. Better to absorb the loss quietly, to pretend the money had gone elsewhere, to say nothing and tell no one, and hope the whole episode dissolved like smoke. Lustig had understood this before Poisson did. The shame was not a side effect of the con, it was the architecture of it. 6 months later, according to the accounts, he returned to Paris. Different stationery, different dealers, the same suite at the Crean, the same performance, word for word. This time, one of the marks went to the police. But Lustig was already gone. He was not a man who stayed anywhere long. He moved, he adapted. Between Paris and New York and Chicago and Vienna, he existed comfortably in the transit between places, the space where identities blur and no one knows quite who you are. He had spent so many years crossing the Atlantic on those liners that he may have come to understand impermanence as a natural state. He ran dozens of cons across his career. One of the most storied, and one that carries the caveat of perhaps, is his reported encounter with Al Capone. According to the story, which has the quality of legend but illustrates something real, Lustig approached the Chicago gangster, persuaded him to invest $50,000 in a financial scheme, promised substantial returns in 60 days, then simply banked the money and did nothing with it. When 60 days passed, he returned to Capone with the full $50,000, but apologized that the T'd Capone, reportedly so impressed by a man honest enough to return his money, something almost no one in Capone's world ever did, gave Lustig $5,000 as a reward for his integrity. Which was, of course, the plan all along. Whether the story is entirely accurate is difficult to verify, and there are versions that differ in detail. But it illustrates something precise about how Lustig operated. He understood that the most powerful move in a con is sometimes the unexpected gesture of apparent honesty. Return the money in full, and the mark concludes that you are one of the rare people in the world who can be trusted. Then they give you more. Capone's $5,000 cost Lustig nothing. It was paid for by Capone's own admiration. He also devised what became known, perhaps apocryphally, as the Romanian money box, in some accounts the Romanian box. It was a machine he claimed could chemically reproduce currency. He would demonstrate it for a wealthy mark. The machine would apparently produce a perfect $100 bill, crisp and genuine. Then he would offer to sell the device. The price was steep, tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the mark. The machine contained real bills hidden inside its mechanism. Once those were exhausted, the new owner would discover that the box produced nothing at all. By then, Lustig was in another city with another name. It was a con that worked because it answered a fantasy nearly every wealthy person has harbored, the fantasy of a machine that simply makes money. The fantasy is powerful enough to override the obvious question, which is, if such a machine existed, why would anyone sell it? Lustig never wrote a memoir, but he is said to have written down his principles, a list that became known after his arrest as the 10 Commandments for con men. The list attributed to him in various forms reads something like this: listen when people talk, never look bored, wait for the other person to reveal their political opinions, then agree with them, never discuss illness unless forced to, never pry into personal matters, never boast, never bloat, don't frankfate, don't ben verrijk voor iets korten. Read it carefully. It reads less like a criminal's code and more like a guide to being genuinely charming, which is perhaps the point. The best con artists, Lustig seemed to understand, are not liars. They are listeners and mirrors, reflecting back what a person most wants to see in themselves, the vision of themselves as shrewd, connected, lucky, deserving. The con does not manufacture greed or vanity or longing. Those exist already. The con finds the crack that is already there and simply pours a little water in. Lustig moved through the United States through the 1920s and 1930s, staying a half step ahead of federal investigators, running sophisticated counterfeiting operations. The fake American currency he produced was described by agents as being of exceptional quality, among the best they had encountered. He was not merely skilled, he was disciplined, treating the craft of deception as a professional undertaking. He was arrested, then escaped. According to one account, he managed to walk out of a federal building by persuading officials that he was someone else entirely. Then he was recaptured. There is something almost admirable in the stubbornness of it, the refusal to retire, except that behind each con was a real person who lost real money and, often, a great deal of real shame on top of it. In 1935, a federal conviction on counterfeiting charges ended the running. He was sentenced to 20 years in Alcatraz, the federal penitentiary on an island in San Francisco Bay, a place designed for people the system had failed to contain anywhere else. The guards there were professionals at keeping people who were very good at leaving. He died in Alcatraz on March 11, 1947. The official cause was pneumonia. He was, by most accounts, 57 years old. His death certificate listed his occupation, with a bureaucratic irony that borders on poetry, as apprentice salesman. He was buried quietly. No monument marks the place. The Eiffel Tower still stands. It was never torn down, of course. It is now the most visited paid monument in the world, a structure the city of Paris once considered an eyesore and has since built an entire identity around. More than 300 million people have climbed it or stood at its base since it opened. Victor Lustig, in his strange and oblique way, told a lie about the tower so perfectly that the men who heard it chose to believe it rather than trust their own judgment. He didn't force them. He arranged a room, dressed the part, told a plausible story in a convincing location, and let human nature do the rest. The Marks walked into the Hôtel de Crayons wanting to matter, and he gave them a story in which they did, until they didn't. That is what follows you out of his story. Not the fraud, not the money, not even the audacity of coming back 6 months later to do it again. The quieter question: how many times do we sit across from someone plausible and persuasive, someone who has correctly identified exactly what we want to hear and simply believe? How many times does the room, the title, the letterhead, the confident, unhurried voice do the work that facts should be doing? The con is older than the Eiffel Tower. It is older than Paris. It will outlast them both. This was Tri-Echoes. Some men leave monuments. Some leave warnings. Victor Lustig left both, and somehow, for the people who met him, neither arrived in time. In April 1943, a dead man washed ashore on the coast of Spain. He was dressed as a British officer. Chained to his wrist was a briefcase. Inside that briefcase were letters signed, stamped, marked Scret, describing where the Allies planned to invade Europe. Adolf Hitler read those letters. He believed them. He moved his armies. And the dead man had never been a soldier at all. This is Operation Mincemeat. By the spring of 1943, the Allies had driven the Axis out of North Africa. The liberation of the continent was no longer a question of if, it was a question of where and when. Next came Europe itself, and the obvious target, the island that sat like a stepping stone between Tunisia and the Italian mainland, was Sicily. Everyone knew it. Churchill is reported to have said, half sardonically, that anyone who looked at a map could see it. The Germans certainly could. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had tens of thousands of men dug in along the island's coasts, supported by Luftwaffe squadrons and Italian divisions. The beaches were mined. The gun emplacements had been sited with care. Any seaborne invasion would be met with everything the Axis could bring to bear. The Allied High Command needed Sicily, but they needed the Germans looking somewhere else. The problem landed on the desks of 2 officers in a small department of British intelligence known as the 20 Committee, or the Double Cross Committee, if you knew its full name and purpose. Their job was deception at the strategic level, feeding false information to the enemy through controlled channels, shaping what the Germans believed about Allied intentions. Their names were Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague of Naval Intelligence and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of MI5. They were, by most accounts, unlikely heroes. One a barrister in peacetime, one an eccentric former RAF officer with a gift for lateral thinking. Between them, in the closing months of 1942, they developed an idea so audacious it sounded like bad fiction. They would plant fake invasion plans on the Germans. Not by leaving documents where they might be found lying around. Not by feeding disinformation to a double agent whose reliability was always, on some level, in question. They would send the documents in the hands of a dead man, a courier who could not be interrogated, who could not crack under pressure, who was already beyond all of that. The plan required a body. The body needed to be fresh enough to be plausible. A man who had died recently, as if from drowning after an aircraft came down at sea. It needed to be a body that could be obtained quietly and discreetly, without raising questions that might trace back to the intelligence services. After a careful and, according to later accounts, ethically difficult search through hospital and morgue records, Montague and Cholmondeley settled on a man named Glendry Michael. He was Welsh, homeless, and had died in London January 1943, likely from the effects of ingesting rat poison, though the exact circumstances of his death are not fully established in the historical record. He had, as far as could be determined, no family. No one was looking for him. He became Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. What followed over the next several weeks was something extraordinary and strange. The construction of an entire life. A fictional life, built from paperwork and personal effects, coherent enough to fool German counterintelligence analysts trained in exactly this kind of deception. Picture what that work actually involved. Every document had to be aged with care. Every crease in a letter had to fall naturally, the way creases fall when a man refolds something twice in his breast pocket. The ink had to dry at a rate consistent with the date on the page. The photographs had to look like a man had chosen them himself, slightly askew, slightly worn at the corner, not like prop room inventory. Montague took the lead and threw himself into the task with something approaching obsession. Major William Martin needed documents, so he got them. A national identity card, a combined operations pass, and a membership card for the Naval and Military Club in London, which the officers called the In and Out because of the signs painted on its gateposts. He had receipts stuffed into his pockets, a bill from a London tailor for a shirt, a note from a jeweler about a ring, a receipt from the Naval and Military Club for 4 nights' lodging. He had love letters. Actual love letters, written in the voice of a woman named Pam, full of longing and the kind of small domestic tenderness that no forger would bother to invent unless they were very serious about the whole enterprise. They were photographs of Pam. There was a letter from a family solicitor fretting about an overdrawn bank account, the kind of small grinding domestic worry that makes a person feel entirely and completely real. And then there was the ticket stub. A stub from a London theater, dated for 2 nights before Major Martin was supposed to have boarded his aircraft. The kind of thing a man pushes to the bottom of his pocket and forgets. The kind of thing that to a German analyst looking for proof of life would be quietly convincing. Each item was debated. Too many receipts and the pockets felt staged. Too few and the man felt thin. They were building a human being out of paper and inference, and the standard they held themselves to was not plausibility, it was truth. Major Martin had to be real enough that a professional would not look at him and feel, somewhere in the back of their mind, the faint wrongness that signals forgery. The fake letters themselves, the ones that would actually move armies, were written with extraordinary care and professional artistry. They were disguised as personal correspondence between senior British generals, slipped into a dispatch case because informal channels were sometimes faster than official ones. They hinted, with studied casualness, that the real Allied invasion targets were not Sicily at all. The documents pointed toward landings in Greece, in the eastern Mediterranean, and in Sardinia, off Italy's western flank. Sicily was mentioned in the letters, but as a feint, a deliberate misdirection to draw German attention while the real blow fell elsewhere. The letters bore real signatures. Admiral Lord Mountbatten contributed a covering note. The military details were calibrated with care, real enough to convince analysts, vague enough to avoid compromising actual Allied operational security. Every crease had been considered. Every smudge, every paperclip. The briefcase itself was chosen deliberately, standard-issue British officer's bag, the kind that would go into the water with a man and stay with him. Major William Martin was ready. On the night of April 29, 1943, the British submarine HMS Seraph surfaced quietly in the cold Atlantic off Huelva, on Spain's southwestern coast. The canister holding Glendry Michael's body was brought up from below decks. The body was eased into the sea. HMS Seraph slipped back beneath the surface and left him there, drifting in the darkness, the briefcase chained to his wrist, moving slowly toward shore. The choice of Huelva was not accidental and not casual. British intelligence knew that Spain, though officially neutral, harbored officials, particularly in the south, who were sympathetic to Germany and who reliably passed intelligence to the Alvar, German military intelligence. A body washing ashore in that particular stretch of coast would be examined. Papers would be discovered, and those papers, the planners were reasonably confident, would travel. Then came the wait. That part does not appear in the thriller versions of the story. The ingenious plan, the midnight submarine, the body in the water, those are cinematic. The waiting is not. But for the men who had spent months building Major William Martin from nothing, the days after April 30th were something close to agony. They could not ask about him, could not check, could not send anyone to Huelva to see what the Spanish authorities had made of their officer. Any contact would risk revealing the hand. They had to wait in silence, while the operation either worked or it didn't, while a dead man drifted through the Spanish bureaucratic machinery and either became someone or disappeared. They did. A Spanish fisherman found the body on the morning of April 30th. Spanish naval authorities recovered Major William Martin. The documents were examined, first by local authorities, and then by people with considerably more interest in their contents. Within days, according to the historical record, photographs of the letters were in the hands of German intelligence officers in Madrid. The Spanish cooperated with the formal return of the documents to British authorities, and they appeared outwardly untampered with. But careful analysis of the envelopes and seals once the briefcase came back showed they had been opened and resealed. Someone had read them. The chain had held. Photographs existed somewhere in the German intelligence system, working their way upward. The Abwehr forwarded the material upward through the chain of command. There, the letters were authenticated. The analysts found no signs of forgery, no inconsistencies in the paperwork, no reason to doubt the identity of the dead officer. The German High Command studied the documents. They concluded that the material was genuine. Hitler himself was briefed. He accepted the intelligence. In early May 1943, the Führer authorized the reinforcement of Greece and Sardinia at the expense of Sicily. Panzer divisions were redirected. Field Marshal Rommel, one of the most formidable operational commanders in the German military, was dispatched to Greece to take personal command of the forces expected to meet the Allied landings there. The German strategic reserve was pointed the wrong way, and there it stayed. On July 9, 1943, Operation Husky, the real Allied invasion, began. 150,000 troops landed on the beaches of Sicily in what was, at the time, the largest seaborne invasion in the history of warfare. The resistance was real, and it was fierce in places. War does not become easy just because one deception succeeds. But the German response was slower and thinner than it should have been. The forces that might have been concentrated to defend the island were spread across the Mediterranean, waiting for raidhead. Back in London, when signals intelligence confirmed that the Germans had fully accepted the bait, Montagu sent a message to Winston Churchill in 3 words: mincemeat swallowed, rod, line, and sinker. The story entered legend almost immediately. In 1953, Montagu published his account under the title The Man Who Never Was. A film followed. The deception became one of those celebrated episodes of wartime ingenuity that people teach in intelligence schools and discuss in history books. People marveled at the cleverness of it, the puzzle box precision, the way it worked. But the man at the center of all of it, the man who had actually carried the documents, who had actually washed ashore in Spain, who had been dressed and photographed and furnished with love letters and theater stubs and a borrowed existence, would not share in any of it. He was buried in the cemetery of Nuestra Señora de la Soledad in Huelva on May 2, 1943, under the name the British had given him, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. Spanish authorities gave him a military funeral with honors, not knowing what he was, not knowing what he carried. For years after the war, the man's true identity was a closely held secret. When Montagu wrote his account, he changed certain details to protect sources and methods still in use. The real name, Glentripishornanes, was not confirmed publicly until decades later, when official documents were released and researchers pieced together what the files contained. He died nameless in a London hospital. He was buried under someone else's name on a Spanish hillside. And somewhere in between, he altered the course of the Second World War. The grave in Huelva was maintained. Eventually, after the truth came out, the headstone was amended. Today it reads, Glendra Michael. Served as Major William Martin, R.M. That sentence, spare, strange, quietly devastating, is one of the more remarkable inscriptions you will find on any grave in any country. It does not say he fought. It does not say he was brave in the ways soldiers are said to be brave. Only that he served. A homeless man who died alone in winter, who was given a name and a rank and a love life and a tailor's bill and a bank that was chasing him for money, who crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a sealed container and changed the outcome of a campaign that shaped the modern world. The audacity of the plan is what tends to get discussed. The cleverness of the fake identity, the forged letters, the theater stub in the pocket. People love that part. The spy thriller precision of it. But the moral strangeness runs deeper and sits less comfortably. These men, Montague, Cholmondeley, the generals and intelligence officers who approved it, borrowed the body of a forgotten man and sent him to do a job that no living soldier could safely do. They dressed him in a life he never had, gave him a fiancée he never knew, and a debt he never owed, and a club membership and a name that rang with rank and purpose, and made him real enough to fool the Third Reich. And then the chief said, "Nein, afterward have you he Christ again?" There is no clean way to feel about that. It was wartime. The deception saved lives, though estimates of how many lives a shorter, less contested campaign preserved are necessarily uncertain. It was almost certainly the right call in the terms by which those decisions are made under the weight of a world war. But it was also the commandeering of a dead man's body without his consent, and the erasure of his actual name from the story for a generation. Two truths resting uneasily against the state. What is certain is this. Operation Mincemeat stands as one of the most audacious strategic deceptions ever successfully executed. The German High Command, with all their intelligence apparatus and their professional suspicion, was deceived at the highest level. They stayed deceived long enough for it to matter. And the man who made it possible never knew he had done it. Glendra Michael had no say in any of it. He was already gone when they chained the briefcase to his wrist. But the dead sometimes carry exactly what the living cannot. This was Triecos. Some men are remembered for what they chose. Some are remembered for what was chosen for them. This story ends in both a grave in Huelva and an invasion beach in Sicily, and in the long silence between a borrowed name and the real one finally written in stone. The summer of 1462. The Ottoman army, tens of thousands strong, commanded by the Sultan who had shattered Constantinople 9 years before, marched north into Wallachia, expecting to end a war quickly. What they found on the road to the capital stopped them cold. According to the accounts that survive, the valley outside Targovie held a forest. Not trees. Bodies. Thousands of them, impaled on stakes, arranged in rows that stretched across the horizon. Mehmed II, conqueror of empires, is said to have looked at that sight and turned his army around. The man who built that forest had a name, and it was not Dracula. Not yet. His name was Vlad. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia. His father had been called Vlad Dracul. Vlad the Dragon, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric brotherhood pledged to defend Christendom against the Ottomans. The son inherited the name in its patronymic form, Dracula, son of the dragon. He did not know that 4 centuries later, an Irish author would borrow that name for a vampire. He would not have been flattered. To understand who Vlad was, you have to understand what Wallachia was, and what it felt like to grow up inside it. Picture a small principality pinched between enormous forces. The Hungarian kingdom lay to the north and west. The Ottoman Empire, the largest military power in the known world, pressed from the south and east, and the rival principality of Moldavia watched from the flank. Wallachia was not large enough to be invincible, and not weak enough to be ignored. It was exactly the kind of place meant for Farvel, where the Pite Hut Fartight, the boyars, the Wallachian nobility, made and unmade princes when it suited them. Alliances shifted with the seasons. A prince who consolidated power too effectively became a threat to someone with enough muscle to remove him. Vlad's own father, Vlad Dracu, was murdered by boyar conspirators, betrayed by the men who were supposed to serve him. His older brother Mercia was buried alive by political enemies, or so accounts say. The family was not strangers to violent ends. And Vlad himself spent part of his childhood not in Wallachia at all, but in the Ottoman court as a hostage. He was perhaps 13 or 14 years old when he and his younger brother Radu were sent to Edirne, held as guarantors of their father's loyalty to the Sultan. Noble hostages were maintained in reasonable comfort, educated, kept as instruments of leverage. Damaged hostages served no purpose. Useful ones needed to be plausible future rulers. The arrangement was rational. That did not make it anything other than what it was. Radu, the younger brother, adapted easily. He learned Turkish, charmed the court, grew close to the future Sultan Mehmed. He would later become a tool of Ottoman policy, installed as a rival claimant against his own brother whenever Vlad became inconvenient. They called him Radu, the Handsome. Vlad adapted differently. What he absorbed in those years is a matter historians weigh carefully. He observed Ottoman military methods, saw how an empire used fear, the systematic, deliberate cultivation of dread as a governing instrument, not merely a byproduct of war, and watched what total power looked like from the inside. Then he came home to find his father murdered, his brother dead, and the throne occupied by a rival installed by the same boyar class that had arranged it all. A boy who watches that, who lives years as a political object in a foreign court, who returns to a country where the nobility treats princes as replaceable furniture. That boy does not grow into a gentle man. He first claimed the Wallachian throne in 1448, briefly, when he was still a teenager. He did not hold it. The next years were years of exile, maneuvering in foreign courts, watching, gathering allies, studying the mechanics of survival. He used the time. In 1456 he returned to Wallachia. This time he held on. What followed was a reign that lasted, with interruptions, until 1476 and left behind a legend so durable it still sells movie tickets. The impalement is where everyone's attention goes, and it deserves to be addressed directly, with the caution that many of the most vivid accounts of Vlad's methods were written by his enemies. German-language pamphlets produced by Saxon merchants of Transylvania who clashed with him commercially and politically painted scenes of extraordinary horror. Ottoman sources had no interest in presenting a man who humiliated their army as anything other than a beast. Later Slavic chronicles are more mixed. Some treat him. None of these sources With that in mind, what the evidence supports. Impalement was not Vlad's invention. It was a known execution method across the region, used by Ottoman authorities and other cinch. He used it against criminals, against political opponents, against members of the boyar class, which, by most accounts, meant essentially all of them. Early in his reign, according to accounts that agree on broad outlines if not every detail, he invited Wallachians, those could have the He also used impalement against Ottoman envoys. There is an account, possibly apocryphal, of ambassadors who refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing custom, and were invited to keep them permanently. Whether true or not, the story circulated and served a function. It told the Ottomans, and everyone watching, that this prince was not a man who would accommodate diplomatic convention when he felt disrespected. A famous German woodcut from the era shows him dining among the impaled, calmly eating while the forest of stakes rises behind him. Whether the image is literally accurate or pure propaganda, it captured something contemporaries believed. And belief, in politics, operates like truth. There is a harder question underneath all of this. Was Vlad's use of terror a calculated political instrument or something more personal? He appears to have believed that visible and total punishment was the only language that worked, that disloyalty and Ottoman collaboration would end only when the cost became genuinely unbearable. In a principality where his own father had been killed by his own nobles, where princes lasted months before being replaced, there is a cold logic to that belief. The flexible, compromised rulers who preceded him and had not survived. Whether that makes the methods justified is a different question entirely. The victims were not a category, they were people, and the scale was, by any honest measure, appalling. Both things are true. What is certain is that he fought the Ottomans, and fought them harder than any Wallachian prince before him. By 1459 or 1460 he had stopped paying tribute to the Sultan, open defiance that amounted to a declaration of war in slow motion. He raided south of the Danube into Ottoman-held territory, burning and killing. In letters to the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, letters that still survive, Vlad himself catalogued the slaughter with precision, citing numbers that ranged, depending on the letter, into the tens of thousands. Those figures are almost certainly exaggerated. Exaggeration whence part of how Tfonk worked. The Raythia. Then Mehmed II came himself. In the summer of 1462, the Sultan crossed the Danube with an army vastly larger than anything Wallachia could field. Vlad could not meet them in open battle. What he chose instead was a strategy that combined scorched earth with systematic psychological warfare. He burned his own crops, poisoned the wells ahead of the advancing army, and drove the civilian population north, so the Ottomans would find no food, no shelter, no local intelligence. The land itself he broke deliberately, turning Wallachia. And then he hit them at night. The night attack on the Ottoman camp, described in several contemporaneous sources, including a report from the Venetian ambassador, was one of the more audacious military operations of the century. Vlad led a force into the encampment in darkness, striking toward what they believed was the Sultan's tent. The attack caused significant chaos. It did not kill Mehmed, the Sultan had been moved, or was never where the attackers aimed. But the camp burned, men died, and the army spent the night in disorder. And on the road to Targovie, they found the forest. Ottoman sources describe it, which matters because Ottoman chroniclers had no reason to exaggerate anything that made their sultan appear to hesitate. The numbers they give vary. The arrangement, deliberate, theatrical, designed to be seen from a distance, does not. Mehmed is reported to have said something to the effect that a man capable of this deserved to keep his country. Whether Mehmed said those exact words is unverifiable. What is verifiable is that the Ottoman army did not take Targovie, did not capture Vlad, and eventually withdrew. It was not a victory in any conventional sense. Vlad had no resources to win a war against the Ottoman Empire. What he achieved was narrower and more important. He made the cost of conquest high enough that Mehmed chose the easier option. The easier option was to install Radu, the compliant brother, as prince, and withdraw. That way the Sultan could leave without appearing to have been beaten. The rest of Vlad's story is the story of a man who ran out of allies. He fled to Hungary expecting the support of King Matthias Corvinus, who had received his letters and his money for years. Instead, Matthias had him imprisoned. The reasons are debated. The most credible reconstruction is that Matthias had accepted crusade funds from the Pope to fight the Ottomans and spent them elsewhere, and needed a justification for the absent campaign. Vlad's captured letters were presented selectively as evidence of atrocity, rather than military correspondence. The man who had actually fought the Sultan became the creamy crease, the Rizahand had not had. He spent roughly a decade in Hungarian custody. Eventually he was released, converted or appeared to convert from Eastern Orthodoxy to Catholicism, married a Hungarian noblewoman, and reclaimed the Wallachian throne in 1476 for the third time. He held it for weeks, perhaps months. The sources are not precise. Then he was killed, in battle, in an ambush by his own men, by Ottoman agents. The accounts do not agree. His head, it is said, was sent to Constantinople, where Mehmed had it displayed as proof that the problem had been resolved. His body was buried, according to tradition, at the monastery of Snagov, on an island in a lake near Bucharest. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 20th century, they found animal bones and the remains of a headless body. whether that body is Vlad's remains genuinely unresolved. He had already, in death, begun to become as elusive as the legend forming around him. The legend took centuries to fully form. Bram Stoker was working on his novel in the 1890s, drawing on Eastern European vampire folklore that had circulated in Western Europe since the 18th century. He needed a name with weight for his Transylvanian nobleman, and he found it in a library book, Dracula. The connection to Wallachia had blurred by then. Transylvania served his atmospheric purposes better, though Transylvania had been part of Hungary and the Habsburg lands during Vlad's actual lifetime, not Wallachia. Stoker's count is not Vlad Whipepe. He does not impale his enemies. He drinks blood, a charge, incidentally, that was leveled against Vlad in some of the more extreme German pamphlets, though historians treat those accounts as slander amplified by political agenda. The vampire is a Gothic invention, assembled from folklore, romantic literary tradition, and Stoker's imagination. He needed a name, found one with menace, and borrowed it. What is interesting is not that Stoker borrowed the name, but what the borrowing reveals. By the 1890s, Vlad's reputation had traveled so far from its origins that a novelist could use Dracula as pure atmosphere, with no obligation to the actual history. The political context, the small principality, the existential Ottoman threat, the brutal logic of a prince with no large army, had fallen away entirely. What remained in the Western imagination was the image, the stakes, the darkness, the monster. In Romania, the memory is more complicated. There is a strand of national memory that treats Vlad as a defender, stern to the point of cruelty, but defending something real against an empire that would have absorbed Wallachia entirely. There are statues. His face appeared on Romanian currency. A poll conducted in modern Romania placed him among the most admired figures in the country's history. This is not a rehabilitation that requires ignoring what he did. It is a recognition that what he did existed inside a specific and desperate context. That the scale, however appalling, was the scale a man believed necessary when the alternative was extinction. Both things can be true at once. He ordered the deaths of thousands without evident remorse. He also held a small principality together, however briefly and bloodily, against one of the most powerful military forces in the world. The vampire's fiction. The man was worse than the vampire in some ways and far more comprehensible in others. He did not drain blood in the night. He made calculations in daylight, the calculations of a man who had learned from childhood that power given up was power that got you killed, that mercy looked like weakness to enemies who offered none, that the only thing standing between Wallachia and absorption was the willingness to make conquest cost more than it was worth. Whether that makes him a tyrant, a defender, or simply a product of an age that has no comfortable modern equivalent, that is the question his story has been asking for 5.5 centuries. It has not stopped asking. This was tri-echoes. Some names outlast the men who bore them. Some men outlast the names they were given and become something stranger, something the world needed whether they wanted it or not. Vlad got both. A borrowed name and a legacy too dark and too real to ever fully become myth. She painted her teeth before a dance to make them glow in the dark. To her, it was fun. She was 22 years old. She worked at a factory in Orange, New Jersey, putting numbers on watch faces with a fine brush dipped in luminous paint. The paint glowed because it contained radium. The company told her it was safe. So she smiled in a darkened room, and her teeth shone, and she laughed. Within a few years, her jaw was gone. Her name was Grace Fryer, and she was not alone. This is the story of the Radium Girls, the women who glowed, what that glow cost them, and what they did with their dying breath that changed the law forever. The 1910s were a strange and dazzling time to be alive in America. The war in Europe had made factories hungry for production, and one of the most coveted products of the era was a wristwatch, but not just any wristwatch. A watch with a face that glowed in the dark. Soldiers needed to read the time in trenches. Officers needed to coordinate movements in the pitch black of no man's land. The demand was enormous. The solution was radium. Radium had been isolated barely a decade earlier by Marie and Pierre Curie, and it sat at the center of a peculiar cultural fever. It glowed with an eerie blue-green light. It seemed almost supernatural. And for a brief, credulous period, the public associated that glow not with danger, but with vitality, with life, with health. This was an era before antibiotics existed, when tuberculosis still killed young people at alarming rates, and the body's vulnerability to invisible forces was something people felt every day. And then along came radium, this extraordinary element that scientists were only beginning to understand, and it seemed, in the popular imagination, to represent not danger, but the future itself. There were radium face creams, radium quotulates, radium water sold redemptions. Once the into this world stepped companies like the United States Radium Corporation, operating out of Orange, New Jersey, and later the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois. They hired young women, hundreds of them, to paint luminous dials onto watches, clocks, aircraft instruments, and military equipment. The work was delicate. The pay was good by the standards of the time, what a teacher or secretary might earn, real money for a working-class girl. And the women who got the job were considered lucky. Picture the painting room. Rows of young women, many of them teenagers, sitting at long tables under pale light. In front of each, tiny watch faces no bigger than a thumbnail, a fine camel hair brush, and a small pot of luminous paint called undark. The paint was a mixture of zinc sulfide and radium powder. The numerals had to be clean and precise. A slip of the brush could ruin the piece. The women who worked the benches described the rooms as lively, filled with conversation and laughter. By many accounts, it was a pleasant place to work. The brushes had to be pointed sharp to paint the tiny numerals accurately, and the supervisors had a solution for keeping the point fine. They called it lip pointing. Lip point, dip, stroke. The women were taught to draw the brush between their lips with a gentle pucker, pulling the bristles to a precise tip. Then dip in the radium paint, apply it to the dial face, and back to the lips again, to reshape the point. Dozens of times a day, every working day. The supervisors, the accounts suggest, offered assurances. The paint was safe, they said. Some women recalled being told that the radium would put roses in their cheeks. There is no evidence that anyone in a position of authority in the early years warned the dial painters of any risk at all. Some of the women went further. They painted their nails with the luminous paint at the end of a shift. They striped their faces and arms to make themselves glow as a prank. One account describes a woman who wore a dress she had painted in the stuff to a dance, turning herself into something like a human lamp. The stories carry a certain gallows lightness now. At the time, they were just girls having fun. The radium went into their mouths, their lungs, the air around them. It settled on their hair and skin. Dust from the dried paint coated the tables, the floors, their clothes. It followed them home. And radium, once inside a human body, behaves with a particular cruelty. Chemically, it mimics calcium. The body cannot tell the difference. So instead of being expelled, the radium travels to where calcium belongs, the bones, the teeth, the jaw. It lodges there, and it does not leave. The half-life of radium-226 is approximately 1,600 years. From inside the bone, it emits radiation, slowly, steadily, long after any exposure has stopped. The damage it causes is not immediate. That is part of what made it so difficult to recognize and so easy to deny. The women started getting sick around 1920, roughly 5 years after the orange factory opened. At first, the symptoms were easy to explain away. Fatigue, anemia, aching teeth. Doctors gave them iron supplements. They were told to rest. Then the jaws began to go. It started as toothaches. Dentists pulled teeth. The sockets refused to heal. Then the bone around them began to soften, to die, to crumble. What doctors encountered and struggled to name was osteonecrosis of the jaw, triggered by radiation damage to living bone. In some women, according to later accounts, segments of jawbone could be lifted out by hand, the tissue having died so completely that it had separated from what remained. It was a disease that had never been explained for. There were other afflictions. Bone cancers, anemia that wasted the body from within, fractures of the femur or spine, bones so weakened by radium-induced deterioration that they shattered for movements as ordinary as stepping off a curb. The women lost weight. They lost mobility. Some lost the ability to walk. At least one physician examining the women in the early 1920s, a dentist named Theodore Bloom, described the jaw condition as so unusual that he coined a term for it, radium jaw. He published his findings. The information existed, and still the dial painters were told nothing. The company, for its part, denied that any of this had anything to do with radium. This is the part of the story that requires a moment to absorb. The companies knew, earlier than they admitted, that radium posed a hazard. Research into radium's effects on human tissue had been ongoing since at least the early 1910s, and the companies employed chemists and engineers who were themselves protected from radium exposure, who did not lip point, who handled the substance with tools, who wore protective clothing in certain operations. The science existed. The precautions existed. They were applied to the scientists. They were not applied to the women on the painting floor. When workers began dying and families began asking questions, the companies responded not with concern but with strategy. They hired physicians who reported, sometimes in terms now known to be false, that radium was not responsible for the illness. They suggested the women's deaths were caused by syphilis, a diagnosis that, in that era, carried devastating social stigma and would discourage workers from coming forward. The science they disputed, the proceedings they delayed, and the truth they continued to deny. The deliberate manufacture of doubt about occupational harm, a technique that would later appear in asbestos litigation and tobacco cases, has its roots, at least in part, in proceedings like this one. Against this machinery of denial stood a handful of dying women. Grace Fryer was one. She had worked at the orange plant in her teens. By the mid-1920s, her jaw had been damaged. Her spine was deteriorating, and she had spent years being told her symptoms had other causes. She began looking for a lawyer to take her case. Most refused. Suing a corporation for occupational disease was largely uncharted legal territory, and the statute of limitations was a largely uncharted legal territory, and the statute of limitations was largely unscratted legal adveratory. Could anybody get to this point? Eventually, in 1927, Fryer and four other women, Quinna MacDonald, Albina Larice, Edna Hussman, and Catherine Schaub, found a lawyer willing to take their case. His name was Raymond Berry, and he took it on a contingency basis. They sued the United States Radium Corporation together. They were known in the press, sometimes with admiration and sometimes with pathos, as the Radium Girls. The case attracted national attention. When the five women appeared in court, some could not raise their arms to take an oath. Some were brought on stretchers. They were visibly, unmistakably dying, and yet they were there. They understood that they would not recover. What they wanted was acknowledgement, legal, public, official, that what had been done to them was real, that the company had known, and that they were entitled to be believed. The company moved to delay, argued procedural points, attempted dismissal on statute of limitations grounds. The possibility that the women might die before any verdict was reached was not abstract. Ultimately, the case was settled out of court in 1928. Each of the five women received a lump sum, according to reports, around $10,000 each, along with annual payments for life and medical expenses. It was not a courtroom triumph, but it forced something the company had worked hard to prevent: public acknowledgement that these women's injuries were real, radium-related, and compensable. The settlement was not the end. It was, in some ways, the beginning. In Ottawa, Illinois, workers at the Radium Dial Company had followed the New Jersey case closely. Many of them were experiencing the same symptoms. When they attempted to bring claims of their own, they encountered the same denials, the same company-funded medical experts, the same procedural delays. One woman refused to stop. Catherine Wolfe Donahue had been a dial painter in Ottawa. By the time her case came before the Illinois Industrial Commission, she had developed bone cancer. She was in her early 30s. By 1938, She was so ill that her deposition had to be taken at her bedside. She could barely move. She testified anyway. The Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in her favor and in the favor of her fellow workers in a decision that established a critical legal principle. The statute of limitations for an occupational disease begins not when the exposure occurs, but when the worker discovers, or reasonably could have discovered, that the disease was caused by that exposure. Workers could not reasonably be expected to sue for harms they had been systematically deceived into not recognizing. The discovery rule, as it came to be known, became foundational to labor law in the United States. It exists today in the legal framework governing what workers can claim when their jobs make them sick. Catherine Donahue died in July 1938, shortly after the ruling. She was 34 years old. The women of the radium factories did not simply suffer. They did something rarer. They forced a system that had dismissed them to reckon with what it had done. Legal historians point to the Radium Girl cases as among the first significant precedents for occupational disease liability in American law, establishing that a company could be held responsible for harm it had created, known about, and concealed. The cases also contributed, over time, to the development of industrial health and safety regulation in the United States. The work of researchers like Dr. Carr, Alice Hamilton, who had been studying occupational disease for decades and whose findings helped build the legal arguments against the radium companies, laid groundwork for later institutions and standards. The women's suffering did not create those protections overnight, but it helped carve the channel through which they eventually flowed. Radium paint for consumer dials was phased out gradually over the following decades. The last licensed use of radium in watch dials in the United States ended in the 1960s. By then, many of the women first exposed in the 1910s were long dead, and those who had survived into older age carried bodies that had never fully recovered. Some of the women who worked at the orange plant were buried in a local cemetery. Decades later, researchers exhumed some of the remains as part of scientific study. The bones still glowed. Grace Fryer died in 1933, 5 years after the settlement. She was 35. Quinta MacDonald died in 1929. Albina Larice lived until 1946. Edna Hussman and Catherine Schaub both died in their 30s. Their names are not well known. They were working-class women in an era when working-class women were not expected to fight back. Not against corporations, not against science weaponized against them, not against the slow erasure of their own suffering. They fought anyway. Some could no longer walk when they came to court. Some died before they saw any resolution. They glowed in the dark, and they were deceived about what the glow meant, and then they spent what remained of their shortened lives making sure it would mean something. Think about what that asks of a person. To be dying, knowing it, understanding finally what was done to you and why it was hidden, and to decide in that condition to keep going, to show up, to testify. They changed the law not because they wanted to be heroes. They changed it because they wanted to be believed. This was Triecos. Some stories leave a mark that outlasts the wound. Some voices carry further in death than they ever could in life. It is midnight on the Western Front. A German soldier climbs out of his trench, walks into no man's land, the strip of mud and wire and corpses that neither side controls, and holds out a cigarette to the man who has been trying to kill him for months. The British soldier stares, then he takes it. This is not a rumor. This is not a single incident. On Christmas Eve and Christmas Day 1914, it happened along dozens of miles of the front line. Enemies shook hands in the mud. They shared food and photographs of their families. They helped each other bury their dead. And then, when it was over, they went back to their trenches and resumed the war. No order made it happen. No general permitted it. No politician declared it. It came from the soldiers themselves, young men who had been fighting a war for 5 months and had decided for one cold December night that they would simply stop. It is one of the strangest and most haunting moments in the history of modern warfare. To understand what happened that Christmas, you have to understand what the Western Front had already become by the time December arrived. The war had started in August 1914 in a spirit of almost delirious confidence. Germany expected to sweep through France in 6 weeks, knock the French out of the fight, then turn east to deal with Russia. Britain expected it would all be over before autumn. Young men on both sides enlisted in enormous numbers, afraid the war would end before they could take part. Newspapers called it the Great Adventure. It did not go as planned. By September, the German advance had stalled. By October, the front lines stretched from the North Sea coast of Belgium all the way south to the Swiss border, nearly 450 miles of trenches, dugouts, barbed wire, and artillery emplacements. 2 vast armies faced each other across strips of devastated ground that ranged from 30 yards to several miles in width. The movement and maneuver that both sides had expected never came. Instead, a war of attrition had set in, and everyone involved was beginning to understand what that meant. The trenches were not what anyone had imagined. Picture what it was actually like to live in one. Not the cleaned-up version you see in photographs, with men looking resolute and purposeful. The real thing. A trench was a ditch, usually no more than 6 or 7 feet deep, cut into waterlogged Belgian or French soil that flooded whenever it rained, and in autumn and winter, it rained constantly. The walls were mud. The floor was mud. When the pumps failed, and they often did, men stood ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep, in a freezing brown soup of rainwater and rot. They slept in shallow alcoves cut into the walls, wrapped in wet blankets, or they did not sleep at all. Cold food was the rule, because fires revealed your position. The same clothes stayed on their backs for weeks. The rats were everywhere. Large ones, well-fed ones, because the trenches were also the front line of a different kind. They came at night, across the duckboards, across sleeping men, drawn by the smell of rations and by something worse. The ground near the front was full of the dead, men killed in earlier attacks and left where they fell. Because the ground between the opposing trenches could not safely be crossed to retrieve them. No man's land. The name says exactly what it was. By day, movement above the parapet meant a sniper's bullet. By night, working parties went out to repair wire or recover the wounded, crawling on their stomachs through a landscape of shell craters and rusted wire and the shapes of things they tried not to look at too closely. Men were killed in the dark by random mortar rounds. They were killed by shell fire while eating. They were killed by a sniper's round at dawn while looking over the top of a trench for a single unguarded moment. The average British soldier in the trenches in 1914 could expect to be killed or wounded within a few months. The average German soldier faced the same calculation. By December, they had been doing this for 5 months. And then Christmas was coming. Something had been developing quietly along the line even before Christmas Eve. In some sectors, an informal understanding had emerged between opposing troops, not an agreement, nothing so formal, just a shared, unspoken recognition. You will not shoot at us when we are collecting our rations. We will not shoot at you when you are repairing your wire. The artillery on both sides will target supply routes rather than the front trenches in the hours around dawn. These arrangements were fragile and unofficial, and they were not universal, but they existed. The military theorists have a name for this kind of thing. They call it live and let live. It emerges when 2 groups of people are forced into close, sustained proximity with each other and begin to realize that maximum violence is not in either side's immediate interest. This is not peace, not sympathy. It is a cold, practical calculation, but it creates the conditions for something else. Then, on the evening of December 24th, something shifted. In sector after sector along the line, most particularly in the areas where British and German troops faced each other, lights began to appear on the German parapet. Christmas trees, or small branches decorated to look like them with candles attached. Little points of flame appearing in the darkness along the enemy line. Imagine that. You are in a trench. You have been in this trench, or a trench exactly like it, for 5 months. The man next to you was killed last week. You have not slept properly since October. And now, appearing out of the darkness across the wire, are small lights. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them, stretching along the line in both directions as far as you can see. Then singing. The German soldiers began to sing. Still not. Silent night. A carol written in Austria nearly 100 years earlier, one that had spread across the German-speaking world and that, by 1914, was already familiar in Britain under its translated name. The sound came across the mud, quiet and clear in the cold air. British soldiers who wrote home about that moment described the sensation as completely disorienting. Lieutenant Sir Edward Hulse, writing to his mother on December 28th, described hearing the singing begin and watching the men around him listen in silence. They had been trained to think of the men in those opposite trenches as the enemy, as a threat, as a force, as something to be destroyed. And now, from that same trench, from those same men, came this sound, rising into the winter air with an almost painful ordinariness. On some stretches of the line, British soldiers called out across the wire. The Germans called back. Some men on both sides climbed onto their parapets and waved, lit their own candles, and called out greetings in the few words of the other's language they had managed to piece together. No one fired. The night passed like that, lights, singing, the occasional exchange of words across the darkness. And then, in the gray dawn of Christmas morning, men began to climb out of their trenches. What happened next was recorded in letters, diaries, and first-hand accounts written by soldiers on both sides, accounts that were collected by historians and that converge remarkably on the same basic picture. Men met in no man's land. They shook hands and introduced themselves. On the ground, they had spent months trying to take from each other. They stood there together. They exchanged gifts. Cigarettes, the most universal currency of the trenches. Tins of beef and biscuits. Buttons cut from uniforms as keepsakes. Paper hats salvaged from Christmas parcels sent from home. A German soldier gave a British soldier a box of cigars. A British soldier gave a German soldier a tin of plum pudding. In some accounts, German soldiers had brought small bottles of schnapps, and British soldiers had brought tea, and they drank both. They looked at photographs. A German soldier showed a British soldier a picture of his wife and daughter in Hamburg. The British soldier showed him a picture of his mother and sister in Lancashire. They stood in the mud of no man's land and showed each other their families, and they discovered they had the same kinds of families. They discovered that the man across the wire, the man whose name they had not known until this morning, was a carpenter from Cologne, or a schoolteacher from Leipzig, or a farmer from Bavaria. And the German discovered that the man opposite him was a bank clerk from Manchester, or a miner from Wales, or a shop assistant from London. They were, in the most disconcerting possible way, recognizable to each other. Some men helped each other with something they had not been able to do during the fighting. They buried their dead. The bodies of men killed in the weeks before Christmas lay in no man's land, sometimes very close to the opposite trench, sometimes right in front of it. Both sides organized brief, informal burial parties, working side by side in the cold to give their dead a grave. Some of those graves got a rough cross. Some of them got a prayer spoken in 2 languages over them. Private Albert Morin of the 2nd Queen's Regiment wrote home about the experience with a precise, unsentimental care that makes the letter all the more striking. He described the German soldiers as, in his words, very decent fellows, not at all what he had expected. What struck him most was their ordinariness. They seemed like men he might have known at home. He found this more difficult to process than he had anticipated. A German officer, Lieutenant Johannes Niemann, recorded that the British seemed unexpectedly approachable, that he had found himself laughing at a shared joke communicated through gestures and broken phrases, and that this had felt, in his own words, deeply strange. Then there were the reported attempts at football. Ist, radiant historians bezittid, and historians kan sing sambretsgungsmiddels lid, welk of, some accounts, scam, scrib, subsample sound som like it sound lit again wangen forgen and aid them ilth. So does it be wave and a kisalakid pushdrone. The truce was not universal. It is worth saying that clearly. In some sectors, the fighting continued without pause on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Artillery shells fell. Men were killed. Some commanders on both sides refused to allow any fraternization, and in those areas none occurred. Some soldiers wanted nothing to do with an informal peace. They had lost friends to the men across the wire. They felt nothing but hatred, and they believed the enemy deserved no goodwill. The Christmas truce, where it happened, was not the whole story of that day. It was one story happening in some places while the war continued in others. The truce, where it occurred, was almost entirely a matter of local initiative. Junior officers who turned a blind eye or who joined in themselves. Soldiers who decided, spontaneously, to respond when a German soldier shouted across the wire. Surgeons who quietly suggested that perhaps the men could stand down for a few hours. There was no coordination. There was no plan. It spread because individuals chose to let it spread. And the high commands of both sides were not pleased. The British military authorities issued orders after Christmas warning that such fraternization was strictly forbidden and would not be tolerated in future. German commanders issued similar warnings. The argument on both sides was the same. This was bad for discipline, dangerous to morale, potentially treasonous. The enemy was the enemy. There was no room for Christmas truces in a modern industrial war. They were right, in the narrow operational sense. A war cannot be fought efficiently by soldiers who have shaken hands with the men they are supposed to shoot, who know their names, who have seen their photographs. The abstraction required to kill efficiently. The enemy as a force, not as a collection of individuals, had been briefly and dangerously punctured. It needed to be restored. And the war was going to have to be fought for nearly 4 more years. In the days after Christmas, the men went back to their trenches. In some sectors, the informal truce persisted for a few more days, an atmosphere of reduced fire, of shots aimed deliberately wide, of a strange, fragile quiet between two sets of men who had looked each other in the face. Burial parties continued on some stretches of the line. In others, the fighting resumed immediately, as though nothing had happened. Gradually, everywhere, the guns came back to life. The men who had shaken hands in no man's land on Christmas morning loaded their rifles and aimed them at the men they had shared cigarettes with. The men who had exchanged photographs of their families went back to trying to kill each other. Some of them could not fully reconcile this. Their letters home from the days after Christmas wrestle with something they cannot quite articulate. There is a recurring difficulty in the accounts. How do you describe shooting at a man whose name you know, whose wife's face you have seen in a photograph, who laughed at the same joke you did 2 days ago? Most of them do not try to answer that. They simply describe what happened and leave the question sitting in the silence. The truces of Christmas 1915 were smaller, more isolated, and more heavily suppressed. Officers who allowed fraternization faced serious consequences. By 1916, by the Battle of the Somme, by 60,000 British casualties on a single July morning, the war had moved somewhere that no Christmas carol could reach. The conditions that had made 1914 possible, the relative novelty of the conflict, the soldiers who still thought of the enemy as human beings they hadn't met yet, the officers who were still finding their way, had burned of 2 more years of toil. It never happened again at that scale. There is something almost impossible to look at directly in the Christmas truce of 1914. The fact of it, not the warmth of it, the heartbreak of it. Men who went back to killing each other within days. These were men who buried each other's dead in the morning and fired at each other's heads in the afternoon. Men who had looked at photographs of each other's children and who would resume, the following week, the business of making more children, fatherless each other's children, and who would resume, the following week, what does it mean? People have asked that question for more than a century. Some have argued it proves that ordinary people do not want war, that wars are fought on behalf of governments, and M.213 was the human truth breaking through the machinery for a single day. Others have argued the opposite, that the truce was a sentimental footnote, and that the slaughter which preceded and followed it, and that the slaughter which has preceded and followed it, and the slaughter which preceded and followed it, and that the slaughter which is preceded mun footnote, and that the slaughter which is small and ver, rithouns and bimizits, and veris had become of their kai quotabilities. Perhaps all of these are partly true. Perhaps none of them get quite at it. What the Christmas truce of 1914 leaves behind is not a lesson but an image. A strip of mud in Belgium or France. 2 sets of young men standing in it, in the cold, on a December morning, handing each other cigarettes and photographs. The war paused for one day, not because anyone commanded it to, but because the people fighting it chose, briefly, to remember that the person opposite them was a person. They had wives, those men, children, photographs, a favorite carol, a fondness for tobacco, a laugh that crossed the language barrier. And then, when the day was over, they went back. This was Triaco's. Some silences do not last, but this one, cold air, candlelight, a carol crossing the wire, echoes long after the guns came